Good morning. My name is Jeff, for those who don't know me, and I'm excited to be able to share in the teaching of God's Word today. Now, for those who may be just joining us, we're going through the Old Testament book of Joshua, and we've been in it for a number of weeks, but I've heard several people on the way in today all tell me what the sermon's about. Everybody knows what the sermon's about. We've been going for weeks now to get to this point. What's happening today? The walls are coming down, right? This is supposedly the crescendo of the story. But I promise you there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. I have to give a little bit of preamble before we get to today's chapter. I think I told you earlier in the series that not a lot of churches preach through Joshua. It's a difficult and challenging book. And this chapter is the reason why folks they tend to avoid it. Because this is there's two ways to approach this. Joshua specifically, this chapter 6 specifically, maybe you grew up in church and you saw this portrayed on the felt board, right? There's the city, they're marching around with the trumpets, the wall comes down, and you think, this is just a story about simple morality, and I don't know if it has anything to teach me. The other way to read this is the way a lot of modern skeptical people approach it. This particular chapter is this is the place in the Hebrew Bible that critics will point to and be like, this certainly looks like the God of the Bible, this loving God that Christians are always talking about, is certainly ordaining ethnically based genocide. And so this is a challenge, and we have to deal with it. We can't stick our heads in the sand so much as I maybe would have preferred that as a pastor and a communicator. We have to deal with this. So I want to give you just from the outset before we read the text that this message will be a little bit unique because it's probably going to be more educational than inspirational. But I can't promise you I won't get excited towards the end, all right? So with that said, let me read the passage on which the teaching's based. We're in Joshua chapter 6. We're going to read verses 1 through 5 and then 15 through 25. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because the Israelites, no one went out or no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." Verse 15. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. When the trumpets sound," the army shouted, "and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so everyone charged straight in and took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys." Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all belonged to her, because she had hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. And this is the word of the Lord. All right, so we're going to look at this under three headings, this challenging passage. We're going to look at it under the heading of the worship. There's the worship, then there's the judgment, and then there's mercy. So first, the worship. The first point to make about these passages, from at first cursory glance, this looks like any other military campaign. You've got a refugee population. They've crossed a topographical feature. Now they're approaching a fortified city. And what you would expect at this point are battle plans. That's what I'm expecting. I'm expecting siege engines and crossbows. And they didn't have crossbows, but catapults. I'm expecting that kind of a thing. I'm expecting a military campaign, but that's not what we get. And that's important because the distinction here is it would have been glaring for first century or earlier readers, but for us, it's important to realize that this is not a war. This is a worship service. This isn't a battle plan. It's a liturgy. And there's a couple of clues. First is the repetition. I didn't read the middle part of the chapter, verses 6 through 14, but if you do check it out, and I would encourage you to do that, there's this constant repetition. God gives them command. You're going to walk around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the seventh day, you're going to walk around 7 times, you're going to blow a ram's horn, and after that, everybody's going to shout, and the walls are going to come down. These succeeding paragraphs all describe, in very similar language, this repetition. This is a worship service. This is a liturgy. That's what's happening here. This isn't a military campaign in the traditional sense. There's no siege ramps. There's no strategy other than to follow the ark. Now, why is that important? We talked about this over the last couple of weeks. The Ark of the Covenant is the visual, kinesthetic reminder of God's covenant love with his people. Now, a covenant, it's a contract, but it is far more loving than a legal contract, right? And it's far more binding than just a love affair. It's like a mixture of law and love. And the ark is the visible symbol of God's covenantal, his loving, contractual, obligatory love with his people, okay? Inside the ark, do you know what's inside the ark? There's three things. There's the word of God. There's the law. On Sinai, God gives Moses the law, and he's inscribed it on tablets, and that is in the ark. This means several things. It means that God is not like a far-off God that you can't know. He has made himself known. He has made his will known. He wants to be known. He is a personal God, and you know because he's given us his word. He's given us his law. And then the other thing in the ark was, it was a jar, and it was a jar full of manna. Manna was the bread-like substitute that God used to sustain Israel during 40 years in the wilderness. It's interesting to note that when they come into the land, the manna stops. It's not that he stopped providing for them. He started now providing for them in a different way through a different means. But it is the symbol that God provides for his people. Third thing in the ark, it's the staff of Aaron. Now, the staff of Aaron is interesting because there's a wooden staff like you're imagining. However, this particular wooden staff keeps having fresh shoots spring out of it. It is somehow alive, though it should be dead. So the visible, tactile symbol of God's covenantal promise contains the symbol that he wants to be known and that he has made himself known through his word. It contains the proof that God provides and sustains for his people. And then it also contains the staff of Aaron, which shows that God keeps the perishable things from decaying, that God he preserves. And this is what goes out in front of them into the Jordan. God stops up the Jordan. They get their own little Red Sea miracle. And this is what they follow as they march around the city for 6 days. Now, there is an application for us. The principle that we see in 3 dimensions here in Joshua is a principle that is all over the scriptures. And it is the faithfulness of God. And sometimes it's called maybe the perseverance of the saints. There is a passage in Galatians 6:9 where Paul describes the principle very vividly. And this is what he says. Let us not become weary of doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Let me ask you a question. For 6 days, Israel walked around. Now, this group of people, they were not privy to the plagues of Egypt or the deliverance out of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the pillar of fire by night and smoke by day, the glory cloud on Sinai. They weren't privy to any of that. They did, however, get a mini Red Sea miracle when God stopped up the Jordan. I have to imagine that around day 3, there's probably a lot of people saying that this plan is stupid. I know that's what I would have done. I would have been like, okay, we're walking around carrying a box, blowing trumpets. I don't see how this is supposed to win the military victory. Because you know what we tend to do when we come to a problem? We want metrics, right? Like, anybody got a fitness tracker? Right? My wife is a little insane about this. If she doesn't get her 10,000 steps, like, we're going on a walk. That's what's happening next. But we want metrics. We want to be able to see that progress is taking place. And if no progress is taking place, we're going to assume a bunch of things. Either a strategy is wrong, God's not listening, or the rest. On day 3, I would have tried to set that city on fire. I know I would have. And there were probably a lot of people on day 4 and on day 5 that were like, I don't know about carrying this box around this wall anymore. Here's the thing. This wasn't about God necessarily delivering the city. However, it was about Israel's orientation when he did. Think about it. They're called to faithfulness. The strength of the plan isn't their plan. This is their faithfulness to what God has told them. They're just supposed to be faithful. What if they had given up on day 5? History would look completely different. And there's a lot of us that have been marching around walls, and it's day 3, and it's day 4, and it's day 5, and we want to quit. And maybe you came in here and it's a marriage, and you're like, I don't see any successful resolution to what we're working on here. It is day 4, it is day 5, and you're tempted to give up. Here's the thing. Day 7 was on God's calendar. And maybe it's an addiction that you've been battling for weeks or months or years, and you think, I've been walking around this wall for days and days and days, and I don't know if God is going to show up. I don't know if he's listening. I don't know if he loves me. I don't know if he's there. Because that's exactly what this produces. If you don't realize that God is faithful and that he fulfills his promises, you got to not become weary by doing good, because at the proper time you'll reap a harvest. The day is on his calendar. It's our job to be faithful, right? Now, your marching it's not earning you anything. It is, however, keeping you oriented. It's about being faithful. Now, there are two responses people will have when you get to day 5 and day 6 and you're marching on the wall and the walls haven't come down yet. The first is, and this, by the way, this is where most religious anxiety lives. Like if you're a Christian, you're supposed to have a peace that passes understanding. And there's a fruit of the Spirit that grow in your life, and it's love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. And so you should be growing in these things, but let's be honest, it's a rocky road, isn't it? Now, this is where most religious anxiety lives, because when you're walking around the wall and it's day 3 and it's day 4 and it's day 5 and the walls haven't come down and you have been faithful, and you know what you do? This is what we do. We treat God like a vending machine, right? You put your money in and the sticker bar doesn't come out. What do? You pound on it, right? You pound on the thing and then you shake it violently. And if that doesn't work, you call some friends. There's a lot of us that treat God like that. When his timeline doesn't quite square with our calendar, that's what we do. We just start shaking the machine. I'm going to pray more. I'm going to go to church more. I'm going to worship more fervently. I'm going to read my Bible more fervently. And I'm going to shake the vending machine until my candy bar comes out. That's a misunderstanding of who God is. It's a misunderstanding of the principle that we see here in Joshua and the one that Paul puts a really fine point on in Galatians. Day 7's on his calendar. You don't come, like we learned last week, you don't come to God and now recruit him into your causes and your plan and say, God, are you with me or you're with them? No, what does he say? He says, no. The real question is, are you with him? And you may not know. I tell you, I mean, you know, our staff and my family, we all have a Google Calendar. We share. I wish he would share his calendar with me, but he doesn't. Your job is to keep marching. Not because you're earning something, but because he is orienting you. If Israel had gone in under their own steam, I mean, who knows what the history books would have recorded, but I can promise you this. You know what? You know who they would have credited for their success? Them. They were like, wow, that was a great plan. Look at us. Who's better than us? Took that city, no problem. But it will never happen that way. The history books will look at it differently for all of time because Israel faithfully followed God for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, what happens? They blow the ram's horn. Now, I know you're all wondering, Jill, ram's horn? Go ahead. That was great. I have one, it's not as good. That was, all right. They blow the ram's horns and the walls come down. Now, we have to get to this is the 600-pound gorilla in the room. Because if you get to verse 21, you'll find out here what happens. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, I told you this was going to be a little more informational than inspirational, and this is the academic part. When you're interpreting the Bible, you have to do a few things. You have to, there's the question of content. What is it saying? What did the original audience hear? What did the author want to communicate? And then there's the question of context. The Bible contains every known genre of literature except maybe comedy. Now, I've read Jesus. I think he was actually kind of being pretty funny at certain times. But it contains, the Bible from Genesis to Revelation contains genealogies, apocalypses, revelations, poems, wisdom, literature, chronologies, land deeds, legal documents. It contains every known genre of literature. Now, Joshua falls into a genre of literature called Old Testament narrative or Hebrew narrative. And it's very specific. It's not quite like the New Testament gospel narratives you read. They're linguistically and stylistically a bit different. This particular piece of literature we're reading, Joshua, is an ancient Near Eastern battle narrative. All right, let me explain to you what this is. We have these. If you're a fan of a college sports team or something like that, you've got a fight song. This is a battle narrative is known for hyperbole and overstatement. Right? And these were common in all the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, everybody, all the ancient Near Eastern cultures had these. And it goes something like this. We smashed them into dust. We blotted their names from the history book. We, buried them 100 feet under the ground. It's devastation language. It's hyperbolic. It's filled with overstatement. Now, why is that important? We read this and we tend to impose upon this particular passage a 21st century construct. We read this and we think God is authorizing, encouraging ethnically based genocide. It's not quite what's happening. This is an ancient Near Eastern battle narrative, and so even though it says it put everyone to the sword, we don't conclude that it's being that this would be the same standard we would be looking at, like maybe something in a 21st century courtroom as far as its accuracy. This is hyperbole. And we know that because elsewhere in Joshua, it says they left all these people alive. In fact, the first chapter of Judges in 27, 28, and 29, it talks about all the people groups that they didn't destroy and how they were kind of a persistent and ongoing, problem for Israel into the future. So they didn't destroy everybody. Now, does that change it terribly? Not really. But the thing that's important to understand is there's at least a few factors. Number one, the destruction was overstated. They didn't ad hoc kill everybody and put everybody to the sword. Number two, and we're going to get to this right now, whenever God would authorize this kind of a campaign, he always made sure that Israel never profited from it. They couldn't take any of the spoils. And if you know anything about the history of human warfare, generally speaking, resources is the reason you do it. And he says, if you're doing this is a quote-unquote holy war, and so therefore you are to dedicate, the word it says, and it pops up 3 times in the text, devote. These items are to be devoted, harim, to the Lord. It shows up 3 times. And this is important. This means that Israel is not to profit at all from this enterprise, financially. The other thing is that this isn't necessarily ethnic cleansing, however, it is judgment. You can read in Leviticus 18 all the really horrible things that the Canaanites were doing. And there is we talked about the principle of first fruits and how God, when he blesses you, you take the first fruits. This is your first and best of the blessing, and you give it back to God. And that Jericho, being the first city in Canaan that they're conquering now, is a first fruits offering to God. So you could read it as a military conquest, but I think a more accurate way to read this is God's judgment, and this is a first fruits offering to God. Now, yeah, horrible stuff happens. A lot of people die. We don't want to stick our head in the sand about that. But I want to say one more thing about this, because now a lot of modern readers read passages like this and they think, oh, how can God be good and this still be in the Bible? And it's fair. I actually have this conversation with young people with a striking degree of frequency. They have very sophisticated objections. There is something I will refer to as the Jesus hermeneutic. You find these stories in the Old Testament, whether it's miracles that are unbelievable, like the parting of the Red Sea or the fall of the walls of Jericho, or there may be social institutions that we see as really regressive. Like here we've got, this is warfare, this is barbaric, this is violent. Elsewhere in the scriptures, you see things like polygamy and patriarchy and the rest of it. What are we to make of all this? And how can God still be good? They were given the ark, and that was their symbol of who God was. And it contained in the ark the reminders that he was faithful and that he preserved and that he provided. We have Jesus. We have Jesus. They have the commandments. We have the Word incarnate. Jesus came, and we know what God is like to a degree that would have made Moses' eyeballs pop out of his head. And Jesus affirms the scriptures, and he says, not the least jot or tittle will be wiped away until all is fulfilled. And when you cut him, he bleeds scripture. And if you go to Luke chapter 24, you have the resurrected Jesus, and he's walking on the road to Emmaus. And he encounters his disciples, and they don't know who he is. It's a rather cryptic, mysterious scene. And as he's walking along, they're telling him about why they're so downcast. And they say, have you not heard the things that have gone on in these days? There was Jesus of Nazareth who was mighty in word and deed, and they killed him. And Jesus says, And then it says he opened the scriptures to them, and he taught them everything that had been written about him through the law and the prophets. He's hanging on the pages of every one of these stories. And we've already gone through great pains to illustrate how Joshua and Jesus actually share the same name. The name Jesus is what happens when you write the name Joshua in Latin and pronounce it in English. This is his namesake. Jesus affirmed the scriptures. He believed the Old Testament. And more than anything, he said those promises, and they seemed a little vague in the ark, the promise to provide and preserve and to be known. Now we got Jesus. He believed all of it. And he says, look, if you believe in me, those promises are true. I will never leave you or forsake you, and I will provide and preserve you in a way you can scarcely comprehend. So if that's you, if you read passages like this and they're troubling, they're upsetting, you're like, oh, I don't know what to do with this, I would encourage you, keep digging. Keep digging. You could get turned off right away and miss some of the most beautiful aspects of the scriptures. As I read the Old Testament, I see Jesus in all of these stories, and you know what it does? It makes my faith grows exponentially. when you see that he was the real Passover lamb, that he is the better Joshua, that David facing the foe that nobody could face on their own, that's actually a picture of Jesus who stepped into the gap and faced death. It's all pointing to him, and it's all about him. Now, finally, the mercy. You'll notice in this chapter there is we kind of loop back to Rahab. In fact, I would say that everyone thinks the wall's coming down to the headline. It's not the headline of this chapter. The headline of the chapter is Rahab. Do you remember Rahab? Rahab was the Canaanite prostitute who hid the spies. He saved them from destruction. You know, the king knew they were there. She hid them. And then they made a deal with her. And they said, look, if you hang this scarlet cord over your window, you'll survive. Everybody in Jericho had the same news. You remember, they all had heard what God was doing, what Israel had done. They toppled several kings and armies. And everyone had the same information in Jericho. But only Rahab said, you know what? I'm going to back a winner. And so she hangs the cord outside her window. And, this is interesting to think about. The Hebrew rather, when it says the walls came down, it's not that they toppled over. The language is pretty specific. They just came down, right? And, we know that Rahab lived in the wall. She lived in a part of the wall because she was poor, and that's probably where the poor folks lived on the out. So, in my mind's eye, it almost looks like a Wile E. Coyote cartoon, just like the wall, and there's one window with a red cord hanging over it. Do you know what that is? That's the Passover lamb. You paint the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, and God's wrath passes over you for a night. You put the scarlet cord over your window, and the wrath passes over you tonight. Do you know what that's about? That's the blood of Jesus. There wasn't anything about those little lambs that somehow stayed God's wrath. Those lambs were pointing to the true lamb. And the scarlet cord that hung over Rahab's window, that is a scarlet cord that goes all the way back to Genesis, where God says to Eve, you're going to have a descendant one day that's going to stomp on the head of the serpent. And that's a scarlet thread that goes all the way through to Revelation, where God says, behold, I'm making all things new. And it's Jesus. And the question here is like, well, who lives and who dies? It certainly looks like an ethnically motivated genocide, but then we get Rahab, who did nothing to merit. Okay, she did, like her record, she's a prostitute, all right? There's nothing about her that's morally superior that should cause mercy to fall on her. She's a Canaanite, she's an ethnic outsider, and she is spared. If you go to chapter 7, there's a cat named Achan. We're going to talk about him next week. He decides to take what is Harim, what is devoted to the Lord for himself, and he ends up put to death. So the dividing line isn't one of ethnicity. What could it be? Everybody else in Jericho didn't think that Israel was going to get over the Jordan. Everybody else in Jericho didn't think that the walls would ever come down. And Rahab chose to believe. And this will show you that salvation is by grace through faith. Buried in this story about ethnic conflict and the wrath of God and sin and judgment, you have woven through the story from the very beginning is the golden thread that's woven through all of the scriptures, and it's that salvation is through faith. By grace, that you're saved by grace. It's a gift. You can't earn it. You can't deserve it. But if you believe, God puts his love on your life, and it changes everything. There's a story in Luke 15. It's the prodigal son. It's a very well-known story. And I'll summarize it for us. There's a wealthy Middle Eastern patriarch. He has two sons, an older son and a younger son. And the younger son is a bit of a rebel. He tells his dad, he says, look, can you give me my inheritance now? I want to get out of here. I'm done with you. Essentially, he says to him, look, I wish you were dead. Give me some money. And his dad does. And the kid goes and he spends it in wild living, and he ends up broke, busted, and disgusted. And he drags himself back, and he thinks, maybe my father is so gracious that he would at the very least accept me back as a hired hand. And he comes back, and the father's love is over the top. He runs to meet him. He throws a robe around him. He gives him a ring. He throws a party. And you know what's interesting about the story is the response of the older brother, the other son. The other son says, all these years I worked for you. You couldn't even give me a young goat so I could have a party with my friends. Do you see the sin of the first son and the second son is exactly the same? That's the point of this passage. The point is, the younger son, what did he want? He didn't love the father, he just loved his stuff. He said, Dad, I wish you were dead. Can I have my inheritance now? The older son says the exact same thing. You couldn't just give me some of your stuff? And that's the point. A lot of times we love God for his stuff. And a lot of that is really wonderful things. It's children, it's family, it's our church community. We love the things that he provides, and sometimes we can love his stuff more than him. When God commands Israel, he says, look, you're going to take all the valuable stuff in this city, and you're going to dedicate it. You're going to make it harem. You're going to set it aside. You're going to make it holy. This was a shadowy vision of what he really wanted. You go to Romans and Paul says, look, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do you know, in Levitical law, you would go to the altar and you would make an offering. And it was usually proportional to the sin. You had a little sin, you had a little offering, big offering. Jesus went and he paid for sin once and for all. Do you know what that means? Among other things, it means that there is now no upper limit on what you can lay on the altar. There is no more tit for tat, and there is no more proportion. He has given you all things. All things. And God has done it at the cost of his son. The way he loved his son, the way I love my kids is a lot, and it pales in comparison to the way God loved Jesus. And God gave him up for you. For you. And he says, look, he doesn't want your gold. He doesn't want your silver. He wants you. He wants you. He wants you to be, for him, harem, devoted, set apart. You are his most prized possession. Can you live like it? This concludes the teaching of God's word.